People love a good story. In fact, Hollywood spends billions of dollars every year creating movies and television shows to entertain us. And those stories influence and persuade us in subtle ways. And that's what this lesson is all about. Understanding the persuasive power of stories and narratives and how we can analyze them to know how they're working to influence us and others. And to do that, we're going to learn a little bit about what is called narrative criticism. But first, let's start by thinking about the power of narratives. The first reason why narratives are so powerful is that they help us explain our world and thus help shape our perceptions of that world. So think of children's stories like Little Red Riding Hood. There's a whole genre of stories that depict the dangers of wandering into the woods. And so for kids, those stories created the perception that the forest was a dangerous place to be avoided, and thus their parents were less likely to worry about them venturing into the woods because of that perception of danger. Now, narratives are also powerful because they help build connection and shared identity. And for this, let's think about some cities and towns that have an origin story. And so, for example, many cities and towns have an origin story, something that they'll still share today about how that city was founded. For some cities, it might be that it was settled by German immigrants. For others, it might be that the city was founded by people fleeing religious persecution. Others might have been founded by rugged individuals who were starting up a lumber mill. Now, all of these origin stories help unite the people of that town around a shared identity or a shared past. And doing so helps them build connections amongst themselves as being people who are similar. In another example, whenever people share personal narratives about themselves, that offers an opportunity for them to build connection with their audience based off of similar shared experiences that they have, that they would only know about because the narrative was shared. In addition, narratives tap into salient emotions and values. So take a moment to think of the Lion King movie and Mufasa's death. In that original Lion King, that moment of Mufasa dying taps into our love for our family, feelings of sadness and pain, and later in the movie when Simba returns, it's tapping into our value of justice, Scar getting what he deserved for killing Mufasa. Normally we would not root for someone to die, but given how the narrative progressed, it tapped into our sense of justice so we would actually be satisfied with someone dying. Narratives also shape our sense of morality and invite moral evaluation of people. And so a story models to us what we should think is proper or what is not proper based off of how the protagonists are heroes and the antagonists are villains do. We are encouraged to be like our heroes, but not like our villains. If a hero stops to help somebody on the side of the road, we learn that that's a good and moral thing to do, and we're more likely to judge others positively if they do things like that. But if we see a villain mistreat their minions, we learn that we shouldn't mistreat others and that that is morally bankrupt. And because of all of that, narratives foster initial attitudes towards action or inaction. So think of television shows, especially those shows in the 90s where the heroes, the protagonists, worked to save the environment and to save animals. So shows like Captain Planet and Seabird. In these shows, the villains sought to destroy the environment for personal gain, but our heroes worked to stop them. Now, the show never comes out and says, you should support efforts to combat climate change, or you should donate money to protect wildlife. But these films are cultivating an attitude where we'll be more caring towards the environment and will work towards protecting the environment. And we see those who are helping the environment as good folks and those who are hurting the environment as bad folks. And all of that is adding towards our first step towards action down the road. In other words, the narrative has cued us to act in particular ways in the future. So now let's take a deeper dive into how we can actually analyze narratives. And we're going to talk about 3 steps. Our first step is the description step. This is when we're just kind of listing things out about the narrative that we are seeing. So we think about the characters. How is the hero described? How is the antagonist described? What are the side characters? What are they doing? We think about the plot. What is the start? What is the end? How do we get there? How does it progress? And a part of the plot is the conflict. So what are the major points of tension? How does the conflict end? What is the setting? And we can ask a bunch of different questions about each of these. So for the setting, we might ask, are we in the past, the present, or a dystopian future? Are we in a city or in a countryside? Are we underwater or in the air? We just try to describe each of these things with as much detail as possible. And in doing so, we come up with a sense of how are each of these things described by the actual text. And that's a key point. We look at how does the text describe the situation or this issue, as opposed to how might this thing actually be outside of our text or our story. And then the next question that we ask is what is emphasized and what is downplayed. And so, for example, if we're reading a book, that author might really emphasize physical appearance, or that author might not mention physical appearance. When we're thinking about the setting, how much of the culture is being described versus is it seem like this could happen anywhere? And once we are finished with our description, we move on to our interpretive step. And this is where we're asking a broad question of how do each of these elements of that narrative work to influence the audience. So here are a couple of examples. If the setting is this dystopia in the not too distant future, that might encourage the audience to feel concern, worry, or fear about their future. For another example, let's think of kids' television shows. If we have a hero that is a hardworking elementary school student who solves problems through their intellect, that might encourage the audience of children to pay attention and want to learn things in school so they can become more heroic. As we go through this interpretive step, also think about the ways that narratives are powerful, and ask yourself if the narrative you're looking at is doing any of the things we've discussed already. So, is this narrative influencing the thoughts and behavior of the audience? How so? Is this narrative providing a perspective on the person's identity? If so, how? What values are being promoted? What attitudes are being promoted? And so think about discussions of representation in the media. A positive portrayal of an LGBTQ character might influence someone who is LGBTQ to value their identity a bit more. And you might initially think your narrative isn't doing this because it's something like sci-fi or horror, but even sci-fi films influence us in these ways. So for example, even when an alien character is sacrificing themselves for others, that still encourages us to think about things like courage, friendship, and self-sacrifice in ways that are positive, especially if the narrative is showing this as a positive, heroic act. And when we complete that interpretation, we move to an evaluation step where we're thinking about a moral evaluation of the narrative or an evaluation of the persuasiveness of the narrative. So let's start with that, the moral evaluation. And in this evaluation, we're just asking things like, should we be viewing this topic in the way that the narrative encourages us to do so? So for example, let's imagine a narrative promotes a hero who acts haphazardly, gets people into trouble, but somehow the day is saved by someone else's action. We might ask ourselves, should we be encouraging narratives that then encourage people to think being a loose cannon is heroic? And we might conclude that that is not the case, and so we should not have these kinds of narratives, or at least be aware that these narratives might have negative repercussions down the road. We can also evaluate the persuasiveness of the narrative by asking overall, how well does the narrative attempt to reinforce or shift the audience's views, beliefs, or actions? As a part of evaluating the persuasiveness of a narrative, we might ask a question about narrative probability. And narrative probability is all about whether or not this narrative makes intuitive sense. Is it a coherent whole? And this question gets us to think about, are there plot holes or other things about the narrative that would distract the audience and make it less persuasive? For example, if there was a character within the narrative that all of a sudden their entire personality changed on a dime and there was no explanation for why this occurred, that character might be less believable to an audience based off of the lack of a logical progression in that character's character. When we're evaluating those narratives, we can also ask a question about narrative fidelity. And this question is about how well does the narrative ring true to the audience based off their life experiences. So imagine that you're watching a television show and a character does something that you do not believe anyone would ever do based off of your experiences. That would undermine the fidelity of that narrative to you and make it less likely for you to believe it. Now the difference is that narrative fidelity is about you as the audience and your life experiences and whether or not it sounds like that could actually happen. And that's different than narrative probability because that is more about how do things progress within the narrative itself, right? And this also applies to kind of sci-fi or horror films. One of the things that I always hear people say about horror films is like, why in the world would you go downstairs if you just heard something? For some people, that act going down the stairs might not ring true to their experiences because they would just have run out of their house and not gone to see what the sound was. And so there you have it, our lesson on narrative criticism. I hope you feel more confident to be able to look at a narrative and analyze it, dissect it, and explain how that might be working to influence somebody.